Is there life beyond the grave? If the soul exists, does it survive death? If so, when did the belief first arise that the soul may reincarnate, to be born anew in another physical body?
Before we unlock the future, we must find the keys to the past. I'm Leonard Nimoy. Join me and open the door to ancient mysteries beginning now, here on A&E.
Thousands of years ago, the ancient Egyptians believed that the soul continued to exist after death, then journeyed to another world. Yet some Egyptians believe the soul returns to Earth and reincarnates in a new physical body. Is the current Dalai Lama evidence of the rebirth of someone who lived before? Why was he chosen to become spiritual head of one of the world's great faiths? Though it may have once been central to Judaism and Christianity, the idea of reincarnation was eventually stifled by church and synagogue. After centuries of suppression, the discovery of a skeleton buried in a basement in New York State ignited widespread belief in reincarnation. In more recent times, a Colorado housewife claimed to have lived in a foreign land hundreds of years earlier. What evidence exists to prove the theory of reincarnation? Step back in time with us as we follow those who've long asked one of the most profound of all questions. Is death the end, or do we live again in a new physical body? It has probably happened to many of us at some time or another. It is called déjà vu. Suddenly, in an area never before visited, there's an indefinable feeling of familiarity. In some mysterious way, there's a sense that you've been here before. Could this be possible? What about the person with whom you've chosen to share your life? Have you known one another before? Perhaps, as some believe, in a previous life? The human mind has grappled with the notion of reincarnation for millennia. In some cultures, the idea was often seen as a threat, warning of dire consequences for an unjust and dishonest life. Might evil deeds committed in a present life lead to reincarnation on a lower level, such as an animal or an insect? On the other hand, would a life of merit promise rewards in the next incarnation? Is belief in reincarnation a conviction as old as humanity's faith in a divine force that creates and judges the world? The overwhelming majority of the Earth's inhabitants believe in life after death. But a sizable proportion also clings to the notion that the soul is not simply destined for heaven or hell, but returns to life in another physical body. What evidence exists to endorse this view, especially as most people probably have no recollection whatever of their previous lives?
Many people feel that reincarnation can't exist because they don't remember their past. And my answer to the world is we do remember. We don't have the details, but we have certain key hints as to who we are, the type of music we like, the people we're most attracted to, the types of food we like, the clothing we wear, certain periods in history that we identify with. These are indications this is where we have been before. And so our present incarnation or our present lifetime is a composite of all the fruits of what we were before.
When did the concept of reincarnation first take root? To probe the mystery, we must embark on a quest deep into antiquity. For the ancient world holds alluring clues to the earliest stirrings of the idea that life may indeed transcend death. It is a belief that may date back to the Stone Age. Tens of thousands of years ago, many primitive societies buried their dead in a fetal position. Could this perhaps suggest a belief in reincarnation, in which the deceased was being made ready for possible rebirth? Today, India remains one of the most vital links with the ancient past. Here, Hinduism is the predominant pathway of faith. At least 5. Much of its origins remain a mystery, but it is the oldest known religion still practiced anywhere in the world today. Acceptance of reincarnation is central to Hinduism. A person's rebirth in a new physical body is believed to be a direct result of how one lived in a previous life. Escaping the endless cycle of birth and rebirth is fundamental to followers of the faith. The process is known as karma. The ultimate aim is to break the cycle, to allow the soul to return to its maker, thus avoiding further reincarnations.
You escape it according to the theory when you completely overcome your egotistical desires, when you become compassionate, when your heart opens up to the whole world, and when you are ready to join your maker. That's when you escape the wheel of samsara, as the Hindus say. But as long as we have desires, we'll come back time and again to satisfy them. Or as long as we have karma to pay, the law of cause and effect will bring us down until our soul matures to that state where it has no longer any reason to come back to this world.
Among the Hindus, the cow has long been held sacred. Why? Is there a conviction that animals have souls too? If so, do they also conform to the laws of karma, to the cycle of birth and rebirth?
And in Hinduism, you can be reborn from human to animal to even lower forms. It all depends on the actions that you perform in the life. You can go up or down. You could be reborn at a lower form, or you could be reborn as a god.
Of all the religions in the East, none adheres more strongly than Jainism to the belief that everything in the world undergoes a process of reincarnation.
In Jainism, we find that the notion of the soul appears not just in humans, but in literally everything that exists. In animals, in plants, in what they call organisms, microorganisms, even in rocks and stones. The soul can progress from form to form. However, the human body is the one body in which souls can become liberated.
So committed are the Jains to a belief in reincarnation that to avoid destroying even the most insignificant creature, many of them wear face masks to avoid ingesting the tiniest of insects. Insects which to the Jains may once have been human. If they're responsible for taking the life of another being, they believe they will reincarnate again to pay a debt for their sin. In neighboring Tibet, Buddhism, originally from India, has been the national religion for some 1,400 years. One of the central texts of Tibetan Buddhism is the Book of the Dead. Once a person has died, a lama or priest will read passages from the book to help a deceased soul choose new parents and a suitable environment for his or her next incarnation. The prayers are intended as a guide to help the soul prepare for a new life in accordance with the deeds and accomplishments of the life just ended. Nowhere does this belief carry such importance as with the selection of the Tibetan Buddhist spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama. Ever since 1694, all Dalai Lamas have lived in the Potala Palace overlooking the city of Lhasa. In 1959, when Communist China invaded Tibet and imposed military rule, the current Dalai Lama fled his capital and settled in India. In exile, he continues to perform the function of religious head of millions of Asian Buddhists. But how did he come to occupy this revered and sacred role? When the 13th Dalai Lama died in 1933, religious leaders immediately began a search to find his successor. But he had to be a reincarnation of all his predecessors. How was he to be identified?
The usual procedure is that the old Dalai Lama, before he gets near to dying, and usually they know when they're going to die, they sort of write some letters, or they leave a testament, or they give some clues to their people and say, gee, I really like that area, I like that town, I like that family. They take those clues into account. Then, after they die, all the local psychics, the Jean Dixons of Tibet, the professional psychics and astrologers are all consulted. And then they say, well, I think he's in the northeast, and I think he lives in this kind of a house and this kind of a family.
Deep in the hills of Qinghai, in China's remote western province, a young boy by the name of Lamo Dondrub was born to a poor peasant family in 1935. But this was no ordinary child. From his earliest years, he was different from other children, often even fantasizing that he would one day travel to Lhasa in Tibet, a place neither he nor his family had ever visited.
When I was very young, I think 1.5 years or 2 years, 3 years, during that period, I always telling my mother, I will go to Lhasa. That, and also whenever I play, and also I play. Now I'm going so there. I'm now moving to Lhasa.
News of the young Lamo Dondrub soon reached Lhasa. In 1937, a search party of disguised high lamas from the Tibetan government set out for the tiny village to investigate the 2.5-year-old boy that they had heard about. Could he possibly be the reincarnated Dalai Lama? From an array of similar items, the young boy was asked to pick out clothing and religious objects that belonged to the previous Dalai Lama. He unhesitatingly chose every item correctly. At one point, he reached out for the Dalai Lama's rosary and claimed that it was once his own. Lamo Dondrub was then subjected to a physical examination in which his body was inspected for certain marks traditionally associated with Dalai Lamas. These included large ears, upward curving eyebrows, moles in certain locations of the torso, and a palm print resembling the design of a conch shell. Without exception, each telltale sign was there. The reincarnated 14th Dalai Lama had been found. Today, the Dalai Lama is revered by Buddhists everywhere. He is not only the leader of one of the Earth's great religions, but he is accepted by all of his followers as the reincarnation of all 13 previous Dalai Lamas. Western belief in the rebirth of the soul may already have been well established by the time of the ancient Egyptians. Pharaoh Amenemhat I of the 12th dynasty ruled the country during the period known as the Middle Kingdom, some 4,500 years ago. According to some scholars, he was popularly known as "he who repeats his births," giving us tantalizing insight into the possible widespread acceptance that the pharaoh lived on after death. The Greeks and Romans attributed belief in reincarnation to an Egyptian mystic known as Thoth Hermes.
The soul passes from form to form, from level to level, and the mansions of its pilgrimage are many. Thou mortals puttest off thy bodies as raiments. Yet thou art from old, O soul of man. Thy soul art everlasting. Thoth Hermes.
Thoth Hermes remains one of the most mysterious figures in all antiquity. Was he a human, a god, or a being of legend? He is sometimes depicted as the ibis-headed god of wisdom, justice, and writing. Whoever he was to leave an indelible mark on Western culture. Some scholars believe that if Hermes were indeed human, he may have been the original author of what is known as the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Found in many tombs and crypts, the hieroglyphs and art that constitute this mysterious document often depict the soul as a human-headed bird called the Ba. After 3,000 years of reincarnating as plants or animals, some believed the soul would eventually earn its right to be reborn in human form.
Let me have possession of my Ba soul and of my spirit, wherever it may be. Observe thee my soul, O guardians of heaven. Cause my Ba soul to find my body. The chapter of making the soul join its body, the Book of the Dead.
During ancient times, it was in Greece that belief in reincarnation eventually became widespread. And at no time more so than when Greek civilization was at its classical zenith. The goddess Psyche was reputed to have been one of the loveliest beings in the entire Greek pantheon of deities. Her beauty was so remarkable that the name Psyche was also used to describe one of nature's most magnificent creations, the butterfly. But because the butterfly was born of a lowlier form of life, the caterpillar, the Greeks had yet another meaning for the word. Psyche also meant soul, representing the ability of a creature's spirit to migrate from a lower order of existence to a higher, more perfect one. The Greeks saw great symbolism in the transition. What may have given rise to it?
It is intuitively natural to the human being to assume continuity in everything. In other words, if you look around the universe, there is nothing that you can find in the universe that does not demonstrate continuity. When wood burns, it becomes ashes and heat. When water flows, it goes somewhere. You know, when water boils, it becomes steam. In other words, in every natural process, we observe continuity. And therefore, it is unnatural that our consciousness alone, or our soul, our deepest level of consciousness, would be the one thing in the universe that would not have continuity.
One of the most ardent Greek believers in reincarnation was the great philosopher Pythagoras. As a mathematician, his name would forever be inscribed in the annals of history. The school that he established at Croton on the mainland of Italy taught mathematics, astronomy, music, and architecture. Pythagoras was not only a gifted and original thinker, but he was said to have had mystical insight into the nature and origin of life. He claimed to have lived many times. It was believed that Mercury, the god of wisdom, had imbued him with the vision to see all his previous incarnations. His pupils were well versed in the mysteries of reincarnation and were encouraged to value life. They were taught to respect the soul of all beings, to refrain from killing any animal, and to adhere to a strict vegetarian diet. Though a teacher, Pythagoras himself left no writings. However, his belief in reincarnation was expounded by three of the greatest Greek philosophers who studied his teachings: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle.
Must not all things at last be swallowed up in death? Yea, but I am confident that there truly is such a thing as living again, and that the living spring from the dead. The souls of the dead are once again in existence. Socrates, 450 BCE.
Though the physical resurrection of the human soul was proclaimed by some of the most admired minds in Western civilization, for centuries belief in reincarnation was either suppressed or simply lay dormant. The concept that the human soul experiences multiple births and rebirths may seem alien to Western thinking. Yet one of the most dramatic examples of a reference to reincarnation is found in a text with which many of us are familiar: the Holy Bible. One of the oldest examples comes from the book of Exodus. Led by Moses, the people of Israel are at the foot of Mount Sinai. Here, following God's orders, Moses delivers the 10 Commandments to them. When he reads the 4th and 5th commandments from the tablets, supposedly written by the finger of God, the people hear these prophetic words:
Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, unto the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me. Exodus 20:4.
This has created a lot of questions for a lot of people. What can that possibly mean? Reincarnationists believe that retranslate generation to incarnation. So the sins of the fathers will be visited upon the 3rd and the 4th incarnations. In other words, the soul will come back, and the sins that that soul in that former life experienced or committed will then have to be dealt with in a karmic sense later on in the 3rd and the 4th generation.
Another example of a passage that may refer to reincarnation in the Old Testament comes from the book of Psalms.
Thou turnest man to destruction, and sayest, Return, ye children of men. For 1,000 years in thy sight are but as yesterday when it is past, and as a watch in the night. Psalms 90:3.
One interpretation of this passage comes from ancient Jewish mystics who believed that there were 1,000-year cycles between the physical incarnations of the human soul. One of the most mysterious traditions of Judaism is an ancient body of mystical beliefs known as the Kabbalah, a Hebrew word meaning to receive. The basis of Kabbalah is believed to have originally been given by God to Moses on Mount Sinai, then secretly passed down from generation to generation. The central book of Kabbalistic study is the Zohar, meaning splendor. It is a lengthy commentary on mankind's relationship with the Supreme Being, on reincarnation, and on the nature of the soul.
There are three aspects of the soul, at least, in the Kabbalah. There's the nefesh, which is the vegetative soul. There is the ruach, or otherwise translated wind or spirit, which is more of a vital, animalistic, some say emotional soul. And then there's the neshama, the higher godly intellectual soul. At death, the nefesh and all three of those aspects have to go through the period of purification, Gehenna, and then they begin to separate. At that point, then the soul prepares itself for rebirth after it's gone through this process. And according to some, there are spirit guides that help it make decisions as to where it goes next, which into what body it incarnates and what lessons it needs to fulfill in the next life.
The study of Kabbalah reached its apex of popularity in 15th century Spain. It was here where Jewish acceptance of reincarnation became widespread. In 1492, the same year that Christopher Columbus discovered the New World for Spain, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella issued one of the most devastating proclamations to befall the Jews. En masse, they were expelled from Spain. Many of the Jews would flee to other parts of Europe. There they kept their religious traditions intact, where they flourished for hundreds of years. But with the dawn of the modern era, mysticism and belief in reincarnation would largely be suppressed.
Reincarnation in Judaism did not go underground until the early 19th century, and the movement to the West, the urge to be accepted by the more, quote, scientific, unquote, establishment in the West. And then reincarnation went underground in some circles, but not in the ultra-Orthodox or Hasidic. And many, many rabbis have called reincarnation, Gilgul, the cornerstone of Judaism.
Christianity is enshrined in the books that make up the New Testament of the Bible. Do any passages within these texts hint at reincarnation?
Let not your heart be troubled. Ye believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. John 14:1.
Does the reference to many mansions refer to the many lives or the many incarnations of the soul? There are those who believe so. Jesus himself may have been referring to his own previous incarnation in this passage from the book of St. John.
Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad. Then said the Jews unto him, Thou art not yet 50 years old, and hast thou seen Abraham? Jesus said unto them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, before Abraham was, I am. John 8:56.
Three centuries after the crucifixion of Jesus, the Roman Emperor Constantine embraced Christianity, declaring it the official religion of the empire. In the year 325, he convened the world's first ecumenical conference, known as the Council of Nicaea. Though consolidating much of the doctrine of the newly established church, the gathering spelt the death knell of belief in transmigration, or reincarnation, among most Christians.
The Christian patriarchs decided that this multi-future life idea was not very good because it was a little too loose. They would like people to feel that there was only one future life, and the quality of that was determined by how well they fit in with the church's orders. And so they banned, therefore, transmigration belief, which was common in all of the Mediterranean cultures.
Though no longer embraced by mainstream Judaism or Christianity, reincarnation may once have been fundamental to both faiths. Ever since mainstream Judaism and Christianity had suppressed the concept of reincarnation centuries ago, little credence was given to it in the West. But by the 19th century, all that was about to change. The place was upstate New York, about 20 miles from Rochester. The year was 1848. The sleepy little hamlet of Hydesville was as quiet and uneventful a place as a small American town could be. However, in the home of John and Margaret Fox and their young daughters Kate and Margaret, a series of strange events were about to unfold. Beginning around the middle of March, the family began to be disturbed by strange noises. Then, on March 31st, the youngest daughter, Kate, challenged the strange, unseen force. In response to the loud thumping noises that she heard, she snapped her fingers in reply. Over the next few nights, she and the mysterious entity worked out a form of communication. Then, the other daughter, Margaret, began asking questions of the spirit force. If your answer is yes, knock twice, she said. If no, knock once. And so, over a period of evenings, it was learned that the spirit in the house once belonged to a man who'd been murdered in one of the bedrooms and buried in the cellar. When the floor of the cellar was dug up, a human skeleton was found buried there, confirming the story. Though the murderer was never found, and the case remained unsolved, what the incident did was to ignite public interest in the survival of the soul after death, a fundamental tenet in belief in reincarnation. Suddenly, spiritualism and the possibility of communicating with departed souls became popular. Additional impetus behind the awakening of a belief in reincarnation came from the other side of the world, from the daughter of a Russian colonel. Born Helena Hahn in the Ukraine in 1831, she, more than any other, was to challenge the conventional view that the soul does not incarnate again after death.
She was born, according to her relatives, with an air of mystery surrounding her. She would often talk about things that were, for the most part, mysterious to the family. They didn't quite know what she was talking about. And she would talk about adventures that she had that everybody knew did not happen, but with such a conviction that it was actually, to her, the real thing.
In her late teens, Helena Hahn married a military man more than 20 years her senior. He was General Nikifor Blavatsky. Thus it was that the simple Helena Hahn would become better known to the world as Madame Helena Blavatsky, eventually to be one of the most influential forces behind a popular rekindling of belief in reincarnation. Desperately unhappy with her marriage, Madame Blavatsky deserted her husband and immediately began traveling the world in search of adventure. Her driving quest was to investigate the religious doctrines of the East.
She traveled throughout the world, including North America, Europe, Egypt, the Near East, India, Tibet. The purpose of her traveling was to try to find the wisdom, the ancient wisdom. And what she did was to collect this wisdom that she studied from books and from elsewhere, and she synthesized it to teach what she called the secret doctrine, or the wisdom of the ages. What she claimed was that this was the primeval religion of humanity and the truth, that the wisdom somehow was corrupted or lost by other religions that retained at least part of it, and what she was trying to do was to rediscover what this truth was.
In 1873, Madame Blavatsky arrived in the United States and found the country in the grip of the spiritualism craze following the strange experiences of the Fox family in upstate New York. Anxious to share the mystical experiences she had in Egypt, Tibet, and India, and to offer insight into those cultures' belief in reincarnation, Madame Blavatsky attended a spiritualist meeting at a remote farm near Chittenden in Vermont. There, she met Colonel Henry Steele Olcott. The two struck up an immediate friendship. In September 1875, Blavatsky and Olcott formed the Theosophical Society, an organization dedicated to the study of occultism, ancient religion, and the process of reincarnation. Madame Blavatsky was a prolific writer, expounding her beliefs in reincarnation in monumental works such as The Secret Doctrine and Isis Unveiled. Madame Blavatsky and Colonel Olcott eventually moved their Theosophical Society to India, where they could be nearer to the Hindu masters from whom they wished to learn more. In 1884, they relocated to Europe. 7 years later, on May 8, 1891, Madame Blavatsky died in Surrey, England. What is her legacy today as one of the first Western exponents of reincarnation and the transmigration of the soul?
Every single writer who speaks on reincarnation probably owes a depth of gratitude towards Blavatsky. It's Blavatsky who gives the definition of what reincarnation is.
It is one of the greatest of all mysteries, and one of our oldest quests. Have we lived before? And following death, do we come back and live again? One of the most compelling cases of a vivid remembrance of a past life took the world by storm in the early 50s. Colorado businessman and amateur hypnotist Maury Bernstein was popular among his friends and associates for his ability to lull people into a trance-like sleep and coax them into recalling incidents from their past, often even as far back as their childhood. However, in 1952, he did not suspect that one of his subjects, Virginia Tighe, would graphically recall incidents from a previous lifetime. When news leaked out that the 29-year-old mother of three was able to recall a past incarnation, Bernstein gave her the pseudonym of Ruth Simmons to preserve her identity and protect her from an increasingly curious press. Under hypnosis, the young woman identified herself as Bridie Murphy, born in the city of Cork, Ireland, in 1798. These are actual recordings made during her hypnosis sessions.
And what is your name?
Bridie.
See, why did they name you that?
They named me after my grandmother, Bridget. I'm Bridie.
Do you always live in Cork?
No, go to Belfast.
You go to Belfast.
Mm-hmm.
What is the name of the priest? What is the name of the father?
Father John. Father John.
At times, while under hypnosis, Ty's voice developed an unmistakable Irish brogue. While never having traveled outside of the United States, she recalled details of her home in Ireland, her family, and the town in which she lived. When journalists investigated the area mentioned by Ty, they found her descriptions to be uncannily accurate. Shops and streets were just as she recounted them. Because thousands of people share the name Murphy in Ireland, it was impossible for them to find exact records of her and her family. Was it all a hoax? Or, as many believe, did Virginia Ty genuinely recall a past life nearly 2 centuries earlier?
I'm holding on to my brother. We can't find our mom. We don't know where our mom is.
Today, in some scientific circles, techniques known as past life regression have become a legitimate, recognized field of research. What have these sessions revealed?
I think the great lesson for me of all of my research and studies is that we do not die when our physical bodies die. A part of us goes on. Whatever you want to call this part, consciousness, soul, spirit, it does go on, and so that we are eternal. And I believe that a famous mystic summed this up centuries ago by saying, we are not human beings here having a spiritual experience, but we are spiritual beings having a human experience.
Get a bed down there, please. Bob.
During clinical death, many have described being able to view their own body from the outside, as though it were a separate entity. Some have even described what happened in the hospital room while their hearts had technically stopped beating, while they were to all intents and purposes dead.
And they can tell you things that happened in another part of the hospital or another part of the city or another part of the world, and in fact it is verified. Like a woman, for example, during her near-death experience, she would tell them what they were talking about when they were signing the death papers. So this is one example of a scientific kind of research that may suggest continuity of consciousness after death.
We may never know the answer to what happens to us after we die until death itself claims us. If we are to heed the evidence and consider the documentation passed down through the centuries, perhaps the riddle of life after death may not be as obscure as many deem it to be. Perhaps death may not be the end, but merely the beginning of yet another cycle in the ongoing process of life itself.
Imagine walking down a street in a city you've never visited before. Suddenly you round a corner and a scene unfolds in front of you. The vendor hawking his wares. The lyrical tones of the traffic, the shadows cast by imposing structures. You're overtaken by a staggering sense that you've been there before. Many believe we have in fact been here before, in a different time, different place, and a different body. This process of death and rebirth is known as reincarnation. But is it simply a comforting belief to help take the sting out of our mortality? Or, as a growing number of researchers claim, is there valid evidence that reincarnation exists?
Hello, I'm Bill Curtis. On this program, the Dalai Lama recognizes a young boy as the reincarnation of a Tibetan spiritual leader. A woman has memories of another lifetime and looks for her past life children. And a birth defect disappears when a boy claims to remember his death on a battlefield in Europe. For those who require scientific proof, reincarnation is a difficult concept to grasp and may always remain unexplained.
On June 17, 1972, in Vancouver, Canada, Carol Airy gave birth to her second child. She and her husband Isaac named the boy Elijah. The doctor assured the couple that all had gone well. The only problem was the baby's feet. Carol Airy noticed them when she held Elijah for the first time.
I unwrapped him, and his feet were like as if you had been sitting, if one had been sitting in a lotus position, his feet were completely turned up.
The doctor told Elijah's parents that it was a commonplace deformity and could be corrected with surgery and special leg braces. The Aires, who had recently converted to Buddhism, wondered if it was a sign of something more. Elijah was born on an auspicious day on the Buddhist calendar. Tibetans celebrate it as the day the Buddha attained enlightenment, a day reserved for the deepest respect. When Elijah was 2 years old, the Aires moved to Montreal. There they established a small Tibetan Buddhist center. Spiritual leaders or lamas would frequently visit the center to give talks. One afternoon in 1975, young Elijah joined the small audience. The 3-year-old became entranced with a particular lama visiting from Tibet.
He went into the room and went to sit very quietly, staring at him, just staring, but very intently. It's a bit strange, but kids are kids and they do funny things.
That night, Carol claims that when she tucked Elijah into bed, the little boy made a startling announcement. He told his mother that he used to have a spiritual teacher. He called him by name and described in detail the room that he had lived in. At first, Carol dismissed this talk. Then Elijah broke into a strange language, a tongue that sounded to Carol like Tibetan. She froze in place.
I suppose if I was sitting in the seat of a skeptic, I would say, oh, give me a break, like it's just normal, everyday occurrences. But when he was 3 and started speaking like that, I'm sorry, that wasn't normal, and no one will convince me that it was just a child having fantasy.
Carol was extremely puzzled by her son's behavior. What had prompted him to come up with such a story? And how had he learned these foreign words? Elijah's parents decided to consult with the visiting lama. The lama listened as Elijah spouted off names: Geshe Kunawa, Mahakala Nakpo, names of Buddhist monks he recognized. The next day, the lama flew to a monastery in India. He promised the Aires he would research the matter. Elijah, he told them, was a very special boy. Over the next few years, Elijah's stories began to grow in scope and detail, taking on a life of their own. "I come from a beautiful planet," he told them, "where the mountains are towering jewels. The trees take on curious shapes, and the roads are long and dusty." Elijah says he has no doubt that these places were real.
I did not perceive it to be a memory. I perceived it to be actual information, sort of like news that was to be reported. It was actual images that I was having at the time and experience that I was going through at the time that I was relating.
3 years went by with no word from the Lama. At age 6, Elijah says the images were so real, he offered to take his sisters to visit his planet in their dreams. One night, the three of them made sandwiches, bundled up in warm clothes, and settled into Elijah's bed for the journey.
I'm sure my parents got tons of phone calls from my teachers and whatnot, saying your son's imagination is terrific, but what are you teaching him? What is going on at home? And things like that, because everyone just thought I had a wild imagination.
Elijah's parents were starting to believe it was more than just an active imagination. Later that year, they received a letter from the Lama. Elijah, he informed them, had been a Buddhist holy man in a past life. He had died in Tibet in the 1950s and now had chosen to return. There was no doubt about it. In 1980, the Dalai Lama, the spiritual leader of Tibet, made his first trip to the West. One of his first stops was Montreal. Carol arranged to take 8-year-old Elijah to see him. What happened at the meeting surprised even Elijah.
I went up to him with a white scarf, which is the traditional offering for lamas, and he said, "I know you. I know who you are. You're the reincarnation of Geshe Jetse." And I was sort of taken aback for a bit.
A photo captures the moment of recognition. With a hint of surprise in his eyes, the Dalai Lama extends his arm and points his finger directly at young Elijah.
That's when sort of my eyes were opened. It was like before I was living in another world almost. And suddenly I came into the reality of the whole thing, and it really hit me.
The Dalai Lama assigned him a Tibetan name. From here on out, Elijah would be known as Tenzin Shurab. Tenzin learned everything he could about the man he calls his predecessor, a monk named Geshe Jetse. He lived during some of Tibet's most tumultuous times, witnessing the invasion and subsequent Chinese occupation of his country. He was known as a great scholar and devout holy man who had many disciples and excelled at debate. With his new identity, Tenzin was about to embark on a lifelong journey as a supposed reincarnated holy man in the modern Western world. At 8 years of age, Elijah Airy was officially recognized by the Dalai Lama as the reincarnation of a revered Tibetan monk and renamed Tenzin Shurab. The news did not surprise the boy in the least. His parents and grandparents, however, were stunned.
It was a very wild ride to come out and say, "Hey, guess what?" And tell them, my son's been recognized, your grandson has been recognized as one of the highest meditation teachers of Tibet. Isn't that wonderful?
Intellectually, Carol and Isaac believed in reincarnation. Emotionally, they were torn. Their own flesh and blood, this child they had raised, was now being told he belonged to another world. The parents wanted to keep the family together. Tibetan leaders, on the other hand, insisted that Tenzin return to them. Over the next few years, the Aries traded letters back and forth with Tibetan religious leaders. They put off repeated pleas to send the Tibetans their Lama. But when the Dalai Lama himself asked Tenzin to join them, the Aries gave in. Tenzin was only 14 years old. It was the most difficult decision of his mother's life.
I know that there'll be people watching this and they'll wonder, how could anybody possibly send their child away? But sometimes in life you have to do things that you don't want to do. But it wasn't easy at all. It was very difficult. That's why I cry.
It happened, and I knew it would at some time. And when it did, I greeted it with my arms open. I said, well, okay, let's do it.
In October of 1986, Carol and Isaac, now separated, agreed their son should go to India. Tenzin and his mother boarded a plane to begin their journey east to the Sera Monastery in southern India, home to 2,500 monks. Tenzin felt immediately at ease in their midst.
He was very comfortable within the monastery. It wasn't a foreign environment. He wasn't anxious. He wasn't nervous about it. He was very, very relaxed. He went right into the life like a fish to water.
Tenzin's early experiences at the Sera Monastery seemed to confirm his reputation as the reincarnated holy leader. The monks said he looked remarkably like his predecessor, Geshe Gyatso. Tenzin learned to speak the Tibetan language in just a few months and proved adept at memorizing complicated religious texts. He also mastered the time-honored tradition of Buddhist debate. In the shelter of his hilltop monastery, Tenzin meditated, searching his mind for the truth. Was he really a reborn spirit? Some small part of him feared it was all a hoax. Buddhist philosophy encourages skepticism. It is one of the Buddha's teachings.
The Buddha always said, don't take what I say as pure gold. Pure gold, if you cut it, it stays gold all through. You have to know if it's true, analyze it, put it into practice, try it, see if it's true. If it's not, then don't take my advice and don't pray to me.
To Tibetan Buddhists, reincarnation is as evident as the stars and the moon. Much as Westerners have studied the frontiers of outer space, Tibetan scholars have studied the frontiers of the human mind. They have systematically analyzed the death process since the 7th century AD. They claim they have thousands of documented cases of people's past life memories. These cases, they say, are proof that the human soul is an energy source that survives even after the body expires.
It is a scientific belief, certainly. They believe they've explored and investigated this realm, that they have personally experienced this realm and remember their transitions through these realms, and therefore they sort of have experimental evidence reported by reliable researchers as far as they're concerned.
After 5 years of intense study in India, Tenzin was convinced he was the reincarnated spirit of Gyatso. But Tenzin felt he would be more approachable as a layperson and better able to fulfill his purpose in the West. With the blessing of the Dalai Lama, he relinquished his vows and returned to a Western lifestyle. Tenzin moved to Paris, where he began studying philosophy. He is a typical Westerner, spending time with his wife, working on his computer, and playing hockey on weekends. He blends right in. Tenzin says he still feels a deep connection to his past life as an enlightened Buddhist monk. He hopes to teach one day at a Western university. In that way, he feels he can pass on his knowledge, his wisdom, and fulfill his karma as a holy man. Is reincarnation the most logical explanation for the things Tenzin supposedly knew as a 3-year-old boy? Most Western researchers don't believe so.
These are all what I call comforting beliefs. They're things that people want to believe in. And I have to admit that I'm not hostile to the idea. I mean, I would like to think that I and the ones I love would live on after this existence, but I can't see any reason to believe that, and it flies in the face of everything that I do in my work in the lab.
Extensive research into the human brain has helped scientists better understand the nature of memory. The brain doesn't work like a videotape recorder, storing life experiences in chronological order so that we can play them back at a later date. Instead, memory is stored in fragments and can easily be distorted by emotion, the passage of time, and new experiences. One of the most common forms of memory distortion is known as cryptoamnesia, or source amnesia.
We can all pick up stuff that we're exposed to, and it can lodge in our brains, and it can come back to us without the tags that tell us where and when we learned it, and therefore it can feel like it's spontaneous and like we must have picked it up in some previous existence because we don't remember picking it up in this one.
Even young children, researchers explain, have the ability to pick up on subtle cues and details and commit them to memory. They say this is most likely what occurred in Tenzin's case.
We've got the parents who have converted to Buddhism at the time of the birth of the boy. We've got Tibetan lamas coming to the house. Who knows what language they might have been speaking in front of the boy? Who knows what movies might have been played? Who knows what books might have been read out loud?
A combination of early exposure, coupled with unintentional coaching from his parents, could explain how Tenzin came up with names and places, how he was able to speak Tibetan words at age 3 and learn the language with ease at age 14. The Arey family does not totally dismiss such arguments, but believes they don't explain everything.
There's many things that in the world that we don't have the capability yet of knowing because we just haven't developed the technology or whatever. And I think we have to be open-minded to these things.
There's nothing to prove perfectly, 100%, that reincarnation exists, that I am the reincarnation of such and such a person. There are similarities, physical similarities between me and my predecessor. How do you explain that? It could be coincidence, if you believe in coincidence. I don't know of any other explanation than the explanation of reincarnation.
Reincarnation is most often associated with Eastern mysticism and the religions of Asia. However, some people of Christian faiths have their own stories of rebirth to tell. One British woman started to question her Protestant upbringing after becoming convinced she had lived before. From a very young age, Jenny Coquelle says she was plagued with visions of her death. They would come to her at night as she slept. The feelings often lingered on to haunt her during the day. These were not visions of a future death, but one in the recent past. Jenny was born in 1953 in southern England. On the surface, her life was like any other child's in the village of St. Albans. But underneath, Jenny's life was different.
When I was a child, I would think about my previous adulthood and my previous childhood. And as I was growing up, it didn't seem incongruous in any way. It was just ordinary memory, and it was just a normal part of my life. Until, of course, I realized that other people didn't have quite the same experiences.
What Jenny remembered with precise detail was the life of a young Catholic woman named Mary, who struggled to raise 8 children in Ireland.
I knew it's the turn of the century up until the 1930s. It wasn't. You'd think it would be from historic cues, looking at the costume, the dress, perhaps the lifestyle. It wasn't. I just knew. Yes, looking back at it, the historic cues were there, but when I was a small child, I wouldn't have recognised them anyway.
Her most vivid memories, she says, were of Mary's death. The images played in her mind like a movie on a large screen. She saw a stark hospital room, a simple window.
I remember seeing the body on the bed in the room, not wanting to leave. And I'd just wake up often at that point where I'd left the body, night after night, and wake up in tears because I knew I couldn't change it. I knew it had happened.
Jenny's mother didn't know what made her 5-year-old daughter cry at night. Her first clue came after Jenny attended Sunday school for the first time.
She was perched on a stool beside me, and she said, they keep talking about the afterlife and what it'll be like in heaven after you're dead. She said, nobody said anything about what it was like in their last life. Is it one of those things grown-ups don't talk about, you know, that how children say these things? And I was a bit surprised, to say the least, of it.
Jenny would sit by the fire and draw detailed pictures. A small 2-room cottage near a bubbling stream. Pictures hanging in oval frames on the wall. One of a woman with a child, the other of a soldier. A jetty where she would wait for someone whose face she couldn't make out. She also drew a series of maps in hopes of being able to pinpoint the town in her memories. Scouring maps of Ireland, she kept returning to a speck called Malahide.
I don't remember how old she was, probably 6 or 7, and she drew a map, and she said this was the place where she lived, or had lived. She didn't know whereabouts it was, but it was a little map, a little street map, and she said, and then you go down here to the cottage, and there's the stream, and laid it all out.
Pat became more and more perplexed by her daughter's strange claims. She did her best to shrug it off as typical childish behavior. Deep inside, however, she wondered if there weren't something to it. Jenny was insistent, and her stories never changed. Jenny said the most overwhelming memories were of her 8 children. She knew each one of their names, knew their faces, their personalities, and she constantly worried about them.
The death itself wasn't a horrific thing, but the leaving the children behind and the fear of what was going to happen to the children and my responsibilities as a mother. I suppose that would seem a little incongruous for a small child to have those responsibilities, but it didn't seem so.
As Jenny grew older, the memories refused to fade. She felt a constant need to search for her lost children, but knew she couldn't ask her own parents to take her to Ireland. It wasn't until after she married and had children of her own that she was able to act on these recollections. In the spring of 1980, determined not to lose those memories, Jenny took one of her childhood maps to a local bookstore. She found her hand-drawn map closely resembled an actual map of Malahide. She then consulted a hypnotist in hopes of learning more details.
Going through that process of the hypnosis, I found that the memories were all of a sudden right at the top of my mind again. I couldn't ignore them anymore. I couldn't leave it, wait, be patient. I had to do something straight away, and that something was to go back to Ireland and walk through the streets.
But Jenny had kids of her own to take care of, and money was tight. It took 9 years, but finally, in June 1989, she traveled to Malahide, 10 miles northeast of Dublin. First, she found the jetty. Then she spotted the small Catholic church she believed she had attended. And after searching through a field of rubble, she found the ruins of the cottage where she remembered living as Mary. Everything was exactly where it should have been according to her childhood maps.
It was great walking back through Malahide after all that time and finding my way around, recognising things, knowing where I was. I had a map, didn't need it. It was, I knew I was coming home.
Jenny's search was just beginning. She learned that a woman named Mary had in fact lived in the cottage, and her last name was Sutton. When Mary died in the 1930s, her children were sent to orphanages. Jenny guessed some of them must still be alive. She was determined to find them. Haunted throughout childhood by memories of another person's life, Jenny Kukel came to believe she was the reincarnation of Mary Sutton, a young Irish woman who died in 1932, leaving behind 8 children. Using these memories as her guide, Jenny located the village of Malahide where Mary had lived. Now she was determined to find Mary's children.
I was very bothered about getting it absolutely right because I wanted to make sure if I found this family that it was the family that I remembered.
Jenny was determined. She placed ads in local newspapers and wrote to all the area orphanages and anyone bearing the last name Sutton. Finally, her persistence paid off. Jenny was able to locate Mary's marriage license and the children's baptismal records.
The whole time I think I was concerned about how I was going to approach the family because I realised that I was going to get to the point where I was going to find them. And I was quite concerned about how I was going to approach them. Whether I had any right to approach them, because obviously I see it, I have the memories of being their mother. I turn up, I'm in a different body, but I have the memories of their mother.
At last, she tracked down Mary's oldest son, Sonny, and mentally prepared herself to make the phone call. What exactly should she say to him? He was only 13 at the time of his mother's death, but likely to have lasting impressions of her. Jenny took a deep breath and dialed the number.
I've been dreaming of your family, she says, since I was about 5 or 6 years old. So I know it's not right to ask a lady her age, but how old are you? I'm 39. So my brain started working again. So you're 39.
That means my mother died 21 years before you were born, he said. Jenny was silent for a moment. Then, tenderly, she proceeded to recount some of her memories. She described the 2 photographs she saw hanging on the wall of the cottage, black and white pictures in oval frames. One of a mother and child, the other a soldier. The accuracy of Jenny's intimate recollections sent a chill down Sonny's spine.
When we finished our phone call, I come and I sat down in the armchair beside my wife, and she looked at me and she says, "My God," she says, "what's wrong with you?" She said, "You look like a ghost." So Ivy said, "I think I'll be talking to my mother."
Jenny made plans to meet with Sonny in person and compare memories.
She gave me the first half and then right away, that's it. You understand? I knew right away what you're talking about.
She saw herself waiting on the jetty, but for whom? She was waiting for Sonny to return from working as a caddy at a nearby golf course. She saw herself standing in front of the cottage, wrestling with a mattress. But why? Once a year, they replaced the chaff in the mattresses and then struggled to fit them through the doorway. With each shared discovery, the conviction grew stronger. Jenny appeared to be the reincarnation of Sonny's mother. Fragments of her memory fit the life of Mary Sutton. Jenny was ecstatic to finally connect the pieces. Still, though, she worried about the rest of the Sutton children. With more research and Sonny's assistance, she was able to locate the 5 surviving siblings. After 60 years of separation, the family was finally reunited.
I've been trying to do it for nearly 60 years, was to find my family, my brothers and my sisters. Right? So Jenny has found them. Now that has given me a great relief and a release of life. I know where my brothers and sisters are now.
My need to find out if the children were all right, it was my need. It was my need left over from when I was Mary. But I had to find out they were all right. I felt responsibility for them. It was still my job, regardless of the fact that I had changed, I was in a different body. It was still my responsibility to make sure that they were all right, to do something for them.
Today, Jenny lives with her husband and 2 children. At last, Jenny says she has found peace in her life. The peace that evaded her until she traveled to the town of Malahide and walked the streets once again. Is it possible that Jenny knew the intimate details of a woman who lived and died before she was born? Critics say it's more reasonable to view Jenny's story as another example of false memory, as they maintain most claims of reincarnation are. Were Sonny's memories shaped by Jenny's impressions? Or were Jenny's recollections subsequently inspired by conversations with Sonny?
The big mistake here is just to take the story without probing, and the way to really do it is to try to break the story. And so anybody who claims to have been alive in a previous incarnation at a previous time should have a storehouse of knowledge. You know, what do people typically eat for breakfast? Whose face was on the most common coin that was used every day?
The problem, scientists say, is that the individuals involved in the stories, not to mention the researchers who investigate them, are looking for confirmation of their beliefs rather than denial. And it's not hard to find, given the ease with which human memory can be contaminated.
In almost all the work I do on false memories, memory distortion, the construction of false memories, the people I study, the people I see, they're people who really believe that they've had these experiences. We're not dealing with deliberate liars. We're dealing with something like an honest liar, someone who thinks that's really their past.
I would see Jenny's feeling that she had lived before, not necessarily proving reincarnation, but in some way the grace of God allowing a message to go to that person so that she could come back, gather the family together, reassure them that everything was all right, everything was in God's hands.
Sonny Sutton and his 5 surviving brothers and sisters don't know how to explain Jenny Coquel's amazing story. Sonny, however, was in a unique position to be able to validate or dismiss her memories. He says they are accurate and that no one else could have known them.
Because the sole fact is, when I sit down and think, and I'm on my own, and I think back to my childhood and what Jenny has done, there must be something, somewhere out there. My mother was with her. My mother is in her. And all of my mother did not rest until she knew that the family was reunited.
I find it difficult when people look upon it just as a belief, as I don't actually believe in reincarnation. I have experienced it. I know that's how things happen.
Are birth defects somehow linked to tragedies from a past life? A growing number of past life researchers believe there is a direct correlation between the physical ailments we suffer in this life and traumatic events we experienced in a former life. Before he reached age 2, Patricia Austrian knew that her son Edward was different from his 6 older siblings. On rainy days at their home in Connecticut, Edward would cry uncontrollably and tell strange stories. As he wept, Edward talked over and over about his shot and pointed to his neck. His parents did not understand what he was saying.
I just figured this is who my son is, and that's it. Accept him for who he is.
Edward was a sickly child. He suffered from chronic sore throats and repeated bouts with tonsillitis. In 1988, when Edward was 4, his father Donald, a doctor of internal medicine, took his son to a specialist. Edward was diagnosed with a rare birth defect, a cyst on the thyroglossal duct in the front of the neck. If left untreated, the cyst could become infected and lead to death. It would have to be surgically removed. But first, the doctor wanted to remove the source of the infection: Edward's tonsils. A few weeks later, Edward was admitted to the hospital for a tonsillectomy. The surgery went smoothly, and Edward awoke announcing that he would not need to have another. That evening, 4-year-old Edward told his mother a peculiar tale. He insisted that he had been an 18-year-old soldier named James, trudging through the mud on a dismal day in France. He didn't know what year, what war. Tired, cold, and hungry, his arms ached from the weight of the gun he carried. Without warning, he heard a shot ring out from behind.
I just remember getting hit right back here, in the back of the neck, and it went and it penetrated through to about right here into my neck.
He said he tasted the salty taste of blood. It filled him. He choked, he gagged, he fell in the mud, and he died. He died there in the mud.
Patricia didn't know what to make of her son's story. At first, she shrugged it off, assuming it was a child's fantasy or the lingering effects of the anesthesia. 2 days after the tonsillectomy, Donald noticed the cyst in the front of his son's neck had completely disappeared. Immediately, he called Edward's doctor.
I had to concur. The cyst had been completely resolved and completely gone. I anticipated that, if anything, this was an unusual event, and anticipated that the cyst would return. It never has.
Not only did Edward's cyst disappear, but his personality changed. He wasn't afraid to be alone anymore. He didn't get anxious, even on the gloomiest days. He did, however, feel the need to repeat his tale. Time and again, he rehashed the story of his life as a soldier.
It wasn't my 4-year-old talking. He had a grasp and a knowledge of things that a 4-year-old child is just not exposed to.
Patricia could no longer ignore her son's stories. She was convinced there had to be something to them, and felt they might be somehow linked to the disappearance of Edward's cyst. After several months of intensive research, she found an explanation that made sense to her. Perhaps Edward was healed by confronting his death in a past life. Could Edward's stories of life and death as a soldier in France have been carried over from a past life? And if so, could they be the source of his unexpected cure? A contingent of past life therapists and researchers are convinced.
At a very early age, Edward had a fairly complete recollection of what it was like to be a soldier and what it was like to die on a battlefield. And he had a corresponding physical problem in his neck.
Bowman explains that by expressing those memories, Edward was finally able to confront the loneliness and fear he experienced in a past life. And as a result, his physical and emotional problems went away.
After reviewing and rehashing all this stuff again and again, and having heated discussions with my wife and other family members, I had to come to the conclusion that there was no other explanation that was plausible. And believe me, I had sat up at night thinking of other ways.
As citizens in a free society, they have every right to believe it if they want. But if they tell me I have scientific evidence of an afterlife or of reincarnation or something, now they're playing in my court, and now they've got to play by my rules, and they've got to come up with satisfactory evidence that is compelling. And I don't see anything that compels me to believe in reincarnation at all.
There are scientists all over the world who have been investigating children's spontaneous past life memories since the early 60s with rigorous scientific methods, and they have documented literally thousands of cases of children from every part of the world who have these memories.
In this state, the memory is very enhanced.
Most of the evidence cited is found in the form of case studies developed from people who have either spontaneously recalled past life memories or have recovered them through hypnotic regression. Critics maintain this so-called evidence is dubious. Human memory, they say, is especially impressionable under hypnosis.
Once they buy into some suggestion during this hypnotic process, they can become very, very confident that they had these experiences.
I've been doing this now for about 18 years, and I've gotten very adept at separating out what is what. Symbol, metaphor, dream-like material, actual past life memories, imagination. Regression therapy is merely the act of going backwards in the concentrated or hypnotic state. So whether you go back to last week, or to your adolescence, or childhood, or infancy, or to past lives, it's all regression therapy.
Scientists, however, insist humans are incapable of forming reliable memories during the first few years of life, which raises the obvious question. If we can't access memories from the beginning of this life, how could we possibly have memories from prior lives? The Tibetan explanation parallels the Darwinian theory of evolution. If a species can evolve with the passing of time in order to adapt to its environment, why can't a soul evolve across many lifetimes? Over many millennia, the ape becomes the human. Likewise, the soul of one person evolves into the improved soul of another.
There's an old saying from the mystics which I like very much. And the saying is, we are not human beings having a spiritual experience here, but we are spiritual beings having a human experience.
Scientists, of course, have a different view. They compare the human brain to the engine of a car. When you shut off the engine, residual energy dissipates in the form of heat. Similarly, when a person dies, the energy generated from the brain dissipates into the environment as heat. Human consciousness simply stops. It becomes nothing. But believers in reincarnation do not accept this.
If you think for a moment clearly, there can be no evidence for the existence of nothing. Nothingness is one thing that you can never prove.
Scientists know there is no proof that a soul disappears when the body dies, but argue that neither is there any evidence to suggest it lives on.
What the reincarnationist is asking me to believe is that even though the organ dies and reverts back to the simple chemicals from which it's ultimately made, it'll plunk down inside the brain of a developing fetus, and it'll force into that complex brain in all the information that allows them to know things, to feel things, to have the abilities, to have the thoughts and experiences and motivations of a brain that took a whole lifetime to get organized, and I just find that totally incredible.
Defenders point once again to what they believe is good evidence. Thousands of documented cases of children who have unexplainable memories of past lives.
There's ample evidence of reincarnation. Now, maybe you can then, after you examine that evidence, you can say, well, I'm still not persuaded. Naturally, that's the scientific process, but you can't say there's no evidence.
I don't think it could ever be possible to physically prove it. We're talking about the realm of faith. This is a level deep, deep down, far deeper than matter and material things.
In 1991, astronomer Carl Sagan interviewed the Dalai Lama, a meeting of science and faith. Carl Sagan wanted to know, if I were to give you proof that reincarnation did not exist, what would you do? The Dalai Lama replied, I'd stop believing tomorrow. But how would you go about designing such a study? Carl Sagan didn't have an answer. For most,
A belief in reincarnation still requires a leap of faith and will likely remain unexplained.